Hello and welcome to episode 47 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, outrages, and triumphs in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh Dehaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Baron, executive director of the CCF.
In today's episode, we'll tell you about the horrifying story of a BC woman who was forced to go to the US for cancer care after she was told that she might be dead before she ever got to see an oncologist.
I'll walk you through a decision that says judges can't just assume vaccines are safe and effective.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about what's going on with Saskatchewan's fight against the federal government's carbon tax. So this has been a really interesting development. As we all know, the Supreme Court a few years ago sided with the Trudeau government that they had jurisdiction to impose this carbon tax in a case called the Greenhouse Gas Emission Pricing Act reference. Now, this was actually a case that I was involved in opposing the tax when I was at a prior role at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So now, the current situation is that all provinces must maintain a carbon tax, and if they don't, the feds will impose one as a, quote, national minimum standard. But a few months ago, the Trudeau government decided to exempt home heating oil from the carbon tax. And the reason, many say, is cynical. It's the Atlantic provinces that really use heating oil. Most other provinces don't use it, or at least they really don't use it widely. And the Trudeau government, they've been struggling in the polls, and they wanted to shore up political support in the Atlantic provinces. And some say that this is the way the Trudeau government decided to do it. And it's obviously not consistent. This exemption is obviously not consistent with the government's claim that the carbon tax is really all about the environment. The reason, there's obviously a lot of reasons, but one of them is that home heating oil is actually a much worse option than natural gas, for example. It is less fuel efficient. It uses about 40% more energy than natural gas. It can actually release toxic fumes. Oil spills, as we all know, are environmental hazards. The feds have actually started a program this week to phase out heating oil. And if the whole idea behind the carbon tax was to incentivize behavioral change, then they don't seem to believe their own argument. They wouldn't let home heating oil become more expensive, and that is part of the incentive for behavioral change. And then they've now created this new phase-out plan. And while details are unclear, it uses the term investment in retrofits to phase out home heating oil. And as we all know, the term investment is government code for taxpayer subsidy. So obviously, this policy of exempting home heating oil, i.e. exempting the Atlantic provinces, is a bad one. It's hypocritical. It's cynical. And it made some other provinces pretty angry about the preferential treatment that's given to places that vote Liberal. And Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, decided he was going to take this fight on. And he announced that Saskatchewan would stop remitting carbon tax payments to the feds for natural gas used for home heating. And for context, just so you know how much the carbon tax is, I don't know how often you look at your natural gas or your home gas bill, but I had a look at mine just before this show, and we pay in my family more in carbon tax than we pay for actual fuel. So to not remit that carbon tax, we're talking about quite a lot of money here for Saskatchewan. And Mo's rationale is, of course, that it's unfair to exclude one type of home heating and not another. So earlier this month, as part of this fight, Saskatchewan sought an injunction to stop the Canada Revenue Agency from accessing Saskatchewan's accounts and seizing the funds that the CRA says is owed. And the province's Justice Minister, Bronwyn Eyre, has said that Saskatchewan shouldn't have its bank accounts garnished for providing the same tax relief as the Atlantic provinces. And Bronwyn said, It's unfair and it's unconstitutional. She said, you have one part of the country which is given a break and another part of the country which is seeing an attempt to garnish its bank accounts. The Supreme Court was very, very clear that the carbon tax had to be about minimum standards, and they explicitly warned about regional favoritism. They said as soon as you start to play favorites, you have a huge problem as the federal government. So on Monday, July 8th, the Saskatchewan government was granted an emergency injunction in federal court to stop the CRA pending a full hearing. And it was the emergency, this was the emergency hearing, and the full hearing for the request was supposed to take place on July 12th, but that was canceled. The parties were supposed to negotiate, and they had until Monday to do that negotiation. It looks like the negotiations were not successful. So ultimately, this case is going to end up in federal tax courts. And one of Saskatchewan's key arguments is that the Trudeau government's decision to exempt the Atlantic provinces through this home heating oil exemption, they say that it goes against the Supreme Court's ruling, which found that the carbon tax was constitutional because it was dealing with an issue of national concern. And they say that this principle has been abandoned by the federal government, which has decided for partisan purposes to selectively apply the carbon tax. And I think this is compelling. I think this is a pretty big burn on what the feds have been up to. I think Mo is right. And the dissent in the original decision really did warn against the favoritism that we're seeing here. In his dissenting opinion, Justice Rowe expressed concerns that the policy could not be legally justified if it, quote, had the effect of favoring or imposing unequal burdens on certain provinces. He wrote that the potential for playing favorites for reasons that have nothing to do with establishing national standards of price stringency to reduce emissions is obvious. Moreover, if regulations are enacted without such favoritism, they could have the effect of unduly disadvantaging provinces or industries in a way that's incompatible with, quote, establishing minimum national standards of greenhouse gas price stringency to reduce emissions. Now, Justice Brown also had a separate dissent where he wrote, this is a model of federalism that rejects the Constitution and rewrites the rules of Confederation. It is bound to lead to serious tensions in the Federation. And we are now seeing those tensions play out with Mo suing the feds, even though this, was litigated pretty thoroughly a few years ago. So I think that the original Greenhouse Gas Emission Pricing Act reference, I think it was decided wrong. And we are now really seeing the chickens come home to roost. Politicians are going to politician. They're doing exactly what both Rowe and Brown were warning about. They are going to play favorites. You don't give a politician a tool like this because ultimately they will use it for their own self-interest, even if they make some, high-browed claim about how this is really about the greater good. Now, Danielle Smith in Alberta, the Premier of Alberta, has said there may be some potential here to relitigate the case. I am not so sure, maybe. There have been some good decisions on federalism from the top court lately. There was the Impact Assessment Act case, which was a good case on division of powers. And the facts here have changed with Trudeau giving the Atlantic provinces this exemption. But ultimately, I'm skeptical that the court would do something different, even though I think they should. One of the dissenting judges, Justice Brown, is no longer at the court. I don't know that the new judge who replaced him would come to the same conclusion as Brown. I think that that's unlikely. But Joanna, what do you think? What do you think of Saskatchewan's move? What do you think about relitigating this? I'm interested in your opinion.
Yeah, well, I think Saskatchewan is really putting the Fed's feet to the fire and creating some new facts on the ground. I mean, the federal government itself created more new facts on the ground when they decided to create special exemption regime for the maritime provinces, given their position and also their political standing with the federal government and the Liberals. And so I just wonder if now what Roe and Brown, I should say, raised as sort of theoretical possibilities, have now come to be shown. And now that Saskatchewan is sort of showing that very nakedly, I wonder if the court, especially given the sort of acknowledgement in some ways, I would say tacitly, that the Impact Assessment Act had, that certain principles were being abused and taken way too far to justify going way too intrusively into squarely provincial jurisdiction. I don't know. I think you're right that it's more likely than not that we wouldn't get a better decision. But you never know with Quebec judges and with the Quebec Chief Justice. What do you think, Josh?
I think the solution here for Saskatchewan is obvious. They just need to elect more Liberal MPs, to quote Rural Economic Development Minister Judy Hutchings, who told Vassy Kapelos of CTV that that was the solution back when it was pointed out that this was like a cynical play to try and hang on to seats in Atlantic Canada that are under risk because people are so angry about the carbon tax there. But in all seriousness, I think that the federalism arguments are really interesting here. And even if we don't get a better ruling, I think that it's important to take on this kind of litigation for provinces like Saskatchewan to fight back against these things, because it keeps it in the public conversation, and it can force politicians to change their policies and change their minds about things that are unfair to particular provinces. So yeah, looking forward to seeing where this goes next. Joanna, let's hear your headline.
Yeah, so was reported on this week by True North. Interesting decision out of the BC College of Physicians Discipline Committee panel. So basically administrative tribunal, but the facts are really interesting. So the headline, the finding was that colleges which oversee and regulate physicians can't just ask legal bodies to accept blanket assertions about the efficiency and safety of COVID-19 vaccines as indisputable facts without providing formal evidence, as we do in administrative tribunals and courts of law, to back up their claims. So this concerns a disciplinary motion that the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons undertook with one of its physicians named Charles Hoff. He practiced emergency medicine in a remote community in rural BC near Lytton. And Hoff, I think it's pronounced Hoff or maybe Hoffy, I'll call him Hoff. I apologize if I've mispronounced his name, who is currently suspended from practicing emergency medicine, alleged deaths and severe adverse reactions to the Moderna vaccine amongst patients ranging from age 38 to 82. And in his response to the college's assertion that Dr. Hoff, in making these statements, was engaging in unprofessional conduct and contravening professional standards, Dr. Hoff tendered 8 expert reports, which address the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, their development, their approval, the risk of vaccines relative to the risks of contracting COVID-19, and also the efficacy and safety of ivermectin. So now, as in its response, the college applied to the disciplinary panel to have the panel take judicial notice of a bunch of facts. I won't recite them all, but they include that the COVID virus kills, that the virus does not discriminate, that vaccines work, vaccines are generally safe and have a low risk of harmful effects, especially in children. Infection and transmission of the COVID-19 virus is less likely to occur amongst vaccinated individuals than for those who are unvaccinated, and also some claims that ivermectin is not approved by Health Canada. So what's judicial notice? It is a procedural concept where judges can accept that a general fact is basically totally accepted, uncontroversial, and established enough that formal evidence that basically the party seeking to have the fact established as under judicial notice doesn't need to prove it, doesn't need to really substantiate their claim. And so the supposed facts here were that vaccines work, that they are generally safe, etc. So in the result, the panel decided to side with the college on a few facts. The panel took judicial notice that, yes, COVID-19 can kill or cause other serious effects. Second, that Health Canada has approved COVID-19 vaccines. That seems to be a pretty binary yes or no. And third, that Health Canada has not approved ivermectin to treat COVID-19. But you'll notice the panel declined to take judicial notice of all of the other facts, including, quote unquote, the college's assertion that the virus does not discriminate, that vaccines work, that they're generally safe. And so the panel gave some pretty interesting reasoning about why it declined to take judicial notice of these facts. First of all, and I think this is the most important point, that were the panel to take judicial notice of these facts, it would basically determine the outcome of the purpose of the hearing in the first place. So if it were to take judicial notice, it would already conclude the matter that, yes, the statements that Hoff made were incorrect or misleading. And it found that given that this was the central issue in the hearing, the criteria for applying judicial notice had to be stringently applied. Then I'll just break down their commentary on one, because I think it really exemplifies how arrogant, hubristic even the college was in their response, just asking the court or the panel rather to just in one fell swoop take judicial notice of all of these assertions. So the court has, sorry, I keep saying court, the panel has some particularly apposite comments about the virus does not discriminate. So the college, in a sense, already conceded that this was an overshoot. So Dr. Hoff had argued in his expert evidence that the virus indeed does discriminate in terms of who's more likely to get infected, but especially the severity of outcomes if you're infected. So obviously, if you are a 24-year-old healthy man, you have a very different risk profile from basically anybody over age, I think about 60. So there clearly is a huge range so the virus does in that sense discriminate. And the college clarified that it just meant everybody is susceptible to catching COVID-19, but it doesn't dispute the fact that once you've caught the virus, the range of symptoms and your risks for severe outcomes varies widely. So the panel took this to be the college essentially conceding that this fact that they were asking the panel to take judicial notice of is clearly overbroad. So panel has similar comments for a lot of these different assertions. And the last thing I'll say is that they distinguished a lot of case law that came out, I want to say, in like kind of peak pandemic era, 2020, 2021. A lot of cases where you saw judges taking judicial notice of things like vaccines are safe and effective, and they reduce transmission and all of these sort of substantive assertions. They were mostly family law cases where there would be one parent, for example, who wanted the kids to be vaccinated and one parent who didn't. And what the panel says about this is that the approach now, so that was the approach in 2020, 2021, where a judge would just say, we're not going to get into, vaccine science, and we're not even going to dispute with anti-vaxxers. We're just going to take judicial notice that the vaccines are safe. Now, in the last year, maybe 2 years, there's been a shift in the approach of family court judges, where they'll instead focus on what's the best interest of the child in alignment with Health Canada. So they'll look at the sort of family situation. In any event, what the panel is very clear about is that is a very different factual context. And of course, the BC College was seeking to rely on all of these cases that took judicial notice. That's a very different context where there than a professional disciplinary matter, where the panel says we need to see a higher degree of procedural fairness. And the part of the question is, were the impugned statements untrue? Were they to just take judicial notice and wrap it all up? and perhaps lead to somebody losing their job, there would be a real issue with procedural fairness. So kudos to True North for reporting on this story. Of course, it means that a full disciplinary hearing on the merits, where the college will have to actually make out these claims and Dr. Hoff will have to counter them, is still going to proceed. So I think it's clear to just delineate between what this decision is and what it's not. Josh, you actually passed this story on to me. What do you think about the decision?
Yeah, I think it's a good one. I think judicial notice is like a little bit out of control. On the one hand, you can understand that courts are really, really busy and that they maybe would prefer to just take some shortcuts and say like, look, whatever Health Canada says, that's probably correct, and we shouldn't have to like sit through all this expert evidence when we're just going to find in favor of that side anyway. It reminds me of actually a conversation I had with one of our listeners, Jack Wright, and he was talking about how if you look at the carbon tax decision, the one that Christine was talking about earlier in the show, the Supreme Court of Canada in that decision seemed to take judicial notice of all kinds of facts related to climate change. And, I'm of the opinion that humans are contributing at least to some degree to climate change. I'm not like a big climate change skeptic, but the Supreme Court took judicial notice of all these facts that are quite debatable, like essentially saying climate change is an existential crisis. And if you look at, even the intergovernmental panel on climate change, they say climate change is bad and people will die and there's all kinds of negative effects. They don't really say it's going to like, wipe out humanity or anything like that, or that it's existential. And I just think courts need to be really, really careful to turn their minds to the idea that their assumptions might be wrong, because we all have assumptions that we know one day will be proven to have been wrong, right? Like time and time throughout history, everybody believes one thing. They believe that the earth is flat, or that that the sun revolves around the earth, or whatever. Like everybody has these assumptions that turn out to eventually be wrong, and courts have to be really careful to make sure that the people coming before them are not actually correct about those things before they dismiss them. So I'm glad to see this. I think it's progress. Christine, what do you think?
Yeah, I think your point about people changing their minds is such an important one. It underpins the value of freedom of expression, because the minority viewpoint, we have seen so many times how the minority viewpoint, which gets persecuted and censured and censored and disciplined, that the minority viewpoint often becomes the majority viewpoint, and that it's through freedom of expression that we can engage in these truth-seeking exercises and determine what actually is true. And the other thing I want to say about this case is, the judicial notice that was taken of all kinds of things related to the pandemic, I think was so inappropriate. And I just am curious. We saw it a lot. We saw a lot of cases where this happened. And I'm curious if this case had gone to the panel in 2021, what would they have taken the judicial notice? I think now we have time and perspective, and emotions have cooled, and sort of panic that set in we're no longer in its grips. So, the panel can say we won't take judicial notice of this, but would they have in 2021? I don't know. Anyway, why don't we take a break, and then when we come back, we'll do your headline, Josh, and then we'll do the bad legal takes.
All right, so before I get into my news headline, I just want to mention a couple of things. So, first of all, if you're a regular listener, we would really enjoy it if you could go and click on the link in our show notes and fill out a very brief survey. That'll give us a sense of, what you like and what you don't like, and that way we can improve. The second thing I want to talk about is a bit of behind the scenes stuff. So the CCF is kind of at a bit of an inflection point, since we've spent more than a decade fighting the BC government's restrictions on private healthcare. And As our listeners know, BC effectively bans private health insurance and they prevent doctors from charging more than the government approved rate, and this makes it financially unviable to offer private procedures. And they do this to maintain a government monopoly that they think is more equitable and efficient, but we know that's not true. And we think these laws lead to wait lists that cause suffering and, in some cases, death, which is a violation of life, liberty, and security of the person. But we took that argument to the BC Court of Appeal in 2022, and we lost. And, some of the appeals judges there agreed with us that in some cases people are suffering seriously or even being killed by the government's laws, which lead to wait lists, but they believe that wasn't arbitrary, and so BC is allowed to continue with its system. And much to the surprise of many observers, the Supreme Court opted not to hear the appeal. So the latest news is that BC is not only not backing down on their monopolistic system, but they're now seemingly trying to punish us for even engaging in this public interest litigation by demanding that we pay $1.7 million in costs. And $1.7 million is a pretty crushing figure for an organization like the CCF, which had $2.1 million in revenue in the last fiscal year, nearly all of it from donations, like more than 99%, I think. And, we're going to be fine. We have a good lawyer in BC this week who will be at the hearing trying to argue those costs down. But it did sort of make us think about where we go from here with our public health care litigation, since it's just so expensive. And you know what? We've decided we're going to keep going. So we still believe rights are being violated by the government monopoly. And we've got some other potential challenges that we're considering taking on. And so we've launched just this past week our summer fundraising campaign to start to build up a war chest for that next public interest healthcare case. And so my headline today, I'm going to walk you through the kinds of cases we're considering taking on. And in particular, I want to tell you about a woman in BC whose case is the kind that we want to take on. And we don't think we're going to be able to take on her specific case for a few reasons that I can't get into publicly, but she's agreed to let us tell her story in the hopes that other people facing something similar will come forward and potentially litigate against the government. So the story is awful and I feel it needs a trigger warning, but we don't do trigger warnings, so I'll get on to it. Alison Ducluso is 58. She's a realtor in Victoria, BC. And in October 2022, she started experiencing abdominal pain. So she went to her doctor who booked her for a CT scan, but the pain got worse. And so she ended up in the emergency room in November 2022. And tests confirmed the worst. It confirmed abdominal cancer, goblet cell carcinoma of the appendix to be specific. And at that point, the local surgeon in Victoria said, you're too ill for surgery. You might be a candidate for chemotherapy, but that's at best going to slow things down. And you've got 2 months to 2 years to live. So, Alison, obviously, she wanted to get onto chemo and explore her options, but she was told the wait to see an oncologist in BC was 2 months or more. And she'd just been told you have, 2 months to 2 years to live. So the surgeon said, basically, go home and get your affairs in order. So she called her kids over, ages 21 and 26 at the time, to say, I'm going to die. This is the end of the road. But after seeing their reactions, she decided, you know what? No, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to dig a little deeper, is how she put it. So friends and family contacted 4 US clinics, and all of them said she's a candidate for a procedure called CRS and HIPEC. And that's a procedure where surgeons basically cut out all the abdominal cancer and then they flood the abdomen with chemo drugs. And this procedure is widely believed to improve quality of life because chemo gets delivered all in one session instead of like over weeks or months. And you're cutting out the cancer, which presumably is going to slow it down. And there's some evidence that for some types of cancer, it does improve your survival rate substantially at the 5-year mark. So Ducluso met with the surgeon in Baltimore in January 2022, which is like a month after she was told you might have only 2 months to live. And within a couple weeks, she had the surgery. Meanwhile, her initial appointment with a BC oncologist wasn't even scheduled till March 13th of that year. So like 3 months after she was told, you have as little as 2 months to live. So, 18 months later, she's alive, she's in remission, she's feeling great, she's working, seeing her kids, her life is mostly back to normal. She's not taking medication, she's not in pain. But she does have these $200,000 in medical bills from having to go to the US because BC wouldn't see her in time. So BC won't reimburse the cost, and sometimes they will, but in this case, they say their surgeon would have chosen a different option for her. And that option, which is very insulting, is palliative chemotherapy. So obviously, she shouldn't have had to leave Canada to access healthcare. She's already paid for that through her tax dollars, but that's where we're at in 2024. And it remains an open question whether people like Duclouseau's constitutional rights are violated by these laws that lead to deadly wait lists that also block them from obtaining private care close to home, like Allison would have preferred. If she had to have private surgery, she should have been able to have it in Victoria. And one of the reasons there's a lack of clarity is because this is what we were trying to show in the Canby case, and you would have thought that we would win because there were a number of judges of the Supreme Court who said back in 2005 in the Chaouli decision, Chaouli in Quebec, that laws blocking patients suffering on wait lists from obtaining private care violate the charter right to security of the person, which is your bodily integrity. And so 3 judges of the Supreme Court said that at that time. 3 judges disagreed, and then a 7th judge said the laws violated a Quebec version of security of the person. So in Quebec, the laws were unconstitutional, but it was sort of a tie on whether the charter, which is Canada's law, prevented similar laws across the country. So curiously, and this is the interesting part, the 3 dissenting judges in that case that sided with Quebec and said, no, this is constitutional, that was in part because Quebec had a safety valve, which is what they called it, which is this little known program where they will pay for people who can't get timely care to go outside of Quebec. And the dissenting judges said individuals denied access to these safety valves could always sue. And so we want to try out a case like that because, it's an open question whether provinces are violating charter rights when they deny funding through these safety valve programs while also blocking care close to home. And Duclouseau is in this process. She's trying to access BC's safety valve, hasn't had any success so far. And there's a lot of details I won't get into about why, but the basics are just that BC Cancer says they would have offered different treatment than what she got, which, as I mentioned, is the very insulting treatment of palliative chemo. So we're looking at Ontario's safety valve. It's called Regulation 28.4. It says doctors can send patients to the US when necessary to avoid death or irreversible tissue damage. And usually they'll look at these cases and say, well, yes, you have tissue damage, but it can eventually be repaired, so we don't have to pay. And the question there is, whether that's good enough for the Constitution, because the constitutional right at issue is being free from arbitrary or grossly disproportionate laws that cause physical or serious psychological suffering. And so we think some of these cases might be open to challenge. Another possible area of attack is Ontario's Commitment to the Future of Medicare Act, which has the purported objective of ensuring access is based on assessed need and not the individual's ability to pay. And that's vulnerable because for some patients, it does the opposite. So, picture a surgeon who can't get enough operating time at hospitals in Toronto, which is very common, like orthopedic surgeons, for example, can't get operating time because that's rationed by the Ontario government. He wants to offer surgeries like in his spare time at a private clinic, and there's people that are willing to pay, say, $25,000 for that surgery. But since the law blocks the surgeon from charging more than what the government will pay, let's say it's $15,000, he's not going to be able to make the numbers work. And that's kind of the point of these laws, right, is to prevent these private clinics from being able to be viable. So what you have is a woman who's able to pay 25 grand for that surgery is forced to suffer on a wait list. But let's say she has a neighbor who needs the same surgery, who has a lot more money. That neighbor can go to the US, pay 25,000 for the surgery in the US hospital, pay another 25,000 to recover in a US hospital. And in that scenario, a law meant to ensure access based on need rather than ability to pay is arguably doing the opposite. It's saying wealthier people can access healthcare because they can go to the United States or Germany or wherever, but middle class people who want to pay to get off the wait list here can't do that. And adding insult to injury, since that middle class patient is stuck on the public waiting list rather than giving up her spot, the patient behind her, maybe who is even less well off, is also worse off. So it's another way where the law appears to be undermining its own objective and is therefore legally arbitrary. So long story short, we're going to continue the fight. If people know anyone who's experienced this type of problem with the healthcare system and wants to consider exploring a challenge, they can get in touch with me, Dehaas at theccf.ca. And like I said, we're doing our summer fundraising campaign so that we can continue to take on healthcare cases like this. So if you have money to donate, go to our website, theccf.ca, and click that donate button. I think that's all I want to say about this. It's a pretty crazy story, and I'm really thankful to Allison for letting us tell it. Christine, what do you think? Any reaction?
Yeah, this story is so devastating. And this is something that could happen to any one of us. And what would we all do if we were in this situation? God forbid. And, good for Allison for fighting back and not just settling for what the government told her, because it's not good enough. And I'm really proud to be an organization that's willing to tell the story of what happened to her.
Joanna, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just add, you were touching on this, but it's sort of a shocking thing that these types of cases have fallen through the cracks, like our, healthcare litigation. And you put it exactly right that yes, if you are imminently going to die, you will be seen. It's these cases, well, although I suppose in Allison's case, the outcome that was being proposed would have essentially led to her death. But it's a lot of cases where it's like hip replacements, knee replacements, things that can cause unbelievable amounts of pain, prevent you from being able to work, but aren't necessarily like you're not literally going to die in 24 hours. And for me, it's just shocking that that has not been found to be an unacceptable violation of the right to life, liberty, and security of the person when you consider the different other areas of life that the Supreme Court has said goes too far. So safe injection sites, the right of sex workers to hire private security and brothels, medically assisted death. So it's just sort of shocking to me that all of this stuff sort of falls below the imaginary threshold when we know how expansive Section 7 has become. So I just find that to be unbelievably unjust. And I could talk about this for many hours, and we have, but let's move on to bad legal takes for a little bit of a lighter conversation. Christine, you want to
Yeah.
start?
Yeah, okay. So I know that this is a podcast about Canadian issues, but I still can't believe that we have made it this far into the show without mentioning the stuff that's happening in the US right now. I mean, the former president survived an assassination attempt with a bullet going through. I mean, it's not funny, it's crazy. I'm laughing because it's shocking what happened. I mean, it missed his head by millimeters. So what I want to do is give some bad legal takes related to what happened with the assassination attempt. But fear not, I will find the Canadian connection. So the connection that I have is that in response to this assassination attempt, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre put out a statement, and the statement said, I condemn in the strongest terms the attempted murder of former President Trump today. I am relieved he is safe. My prayers are with other innocent people harmed or killed by this heinous act. I am also happy that the suspected shooter is dead. So there were a bunch of really weird reactions to this statement. One, and we can have our own perspective on that statement. I mean, we've debated it among ourselves. I think maybe it was like a little weird, but mostly fine. Josh loves it. But I think it's mostly Joanna doesn't like it. She would have preferred that the assassin was put on trial. But I don't like, frankly, don't care. My opinion, I don't care that he's dead. I think he was an active shooter, and that's what happens if you shoot at the president, you get killed. Uh, that there were some people who disagreed with this, what I think is a pretty reasonable take. So, a University of Guelph lecturer named Shoshana Jacobs said in response to Pierre's tweet, "We're executing suspects now." Now, keep in mind, she also reposted the assassination video with the comment where 4 inches really matters, and retweeted some other bizarre things. It led some people to conclude that she was actually sad that the shooter missed, but I suppose this is open to interpretation. So that's weird. But no, the Secret Service taking out an active shooter, shooting at the former president and murdering people in a crowd. Because, keep in mind, there were 3 other people shot, one who died. That is not a execution of a quote suspect. It is a completely valid tactical response. It is the only valid tactical response. Like, that is the only response the Secret Service should have, which should be to shoot the person shooting at the president. I thought that was a weird take, but that from Jacobs, but she was not the only one who had this take. Kelly Elliott said in response to Pierre's tweet, quote, "Being happy that a quote suspected shooter is dead is not how democracy works. Cheering for extrajudicial murders and canceling experts," I don't know what that part is, "but is not democracy." Again, this is not an extrajudicial murder of a quote suspected shooter. He was actually shooting at the president. And then another take was Noel posted, "Democracy usually involves due process, you wacko." Again, taking out an active shooter is not undemocratic. I suppose the most charitable thing I could say is that maybe capturing him and capturing him alive and then putting him on trial would have been good. That's Joanna's take. But I don't think that's the point she was trying to make. It's also not undemocratic to stop a shooter trying to kill the former president, as I have said repeatedly. So I think that these legal takes were so bad. I think that Pierre Poilievre might have actually phrased his tweet the way he did, saying, "I'm happy the shooter is dead," just to like kind of bait out these kinds of responses to show how absolutely psychotic the people who disagree with him are. And if that is what he was trying to do, like, mission accomplished. These people are wacko. Like, those are crazy responses. Okay, Joanna, what's your bad legal take?
Okay, so my bad legal take goes to Minister of Justice Arif Virani, who put out a short explainer video which purported to debunk some myths about the much critiqued Liberals' new capital gains tax. And particularly, he said a lot of things, and Michelle Rempel Garner did a good explainer with a tax expert, but I'm just going to focus on one because we're lawyers. We don't like to talk about the nuances of tax policy. We're not good at math, but this one is pretty intuitive. So he says, Virani says, "First of all, if you pass on the cottage to someone in your family, there is no capital gain that's incurred." So that is blatant misunderstanding. So first of all, there's no special definition for a family cottage within the Income Tax Act. And if you own a second property that you use for recreation, like a cottage, the only way that you can pass it on without incurring capital gains tax is if you pass it on to your spouse or common law partner. So if you pass it on to anyone else in your family, which is very common that you would pass it on to, for example, your child, etc., then the tax increase does apply. And we'll link Michelle Rempel Garner goes through a lot of other gaslighting and honestly just adding to confusion and misinformation. Virani confused the tax rate with the inclusion rate. Again, I'm not going to get into it, but I think there's already a lot of misinformation flowing around about the new capital gains increase, and Virani just seemed to worsen it, which maybe just adds to the point that lawyers shouldn't talk about taxes. So My bad legal take is to Arif Virani for lying to us about the rules of capital gains tax. If you are a privileged person who owns a cottage and wants to pass it on to your kid, yes, you will pay capital gains tax, most likely at the 2/3 rate. Josh, what's your bad legal take?
Okay, my bad legal take goes to the Law Society of Manitoba panel that gave what I think is too light of a punishment to a lawyer who faced his fourth round of discipline by the Law Society. And according to the decision, this lawyer's been practicing since 1989. And the reason he's in trouble this time is he was on the phone with a court registrar confirming whether or not a document had been filed with an articling student standing beside him. And for whatever reason, it's not clear from the decision, the lawyer decided to punch the articling student in the groin, apparently so hard that the articling student was doubled over in pain. And on the one hand, I've met some articling students and I can sort of understand wanting to punch them, but you're a lawyer and you can't do that. And I think it's serious psycho behavior to, punch someone that's sort of beneath you in the organization and that's just a student trying to learn the law. And the Law Society panel gave this guy a 6-month suspension from law, banned him from supervising articling students for at least 2 years, and they also made him pay $2,500 in costs. And maybe that would be an appropriate punishment, except that this is like the fourth time he's been disciplined. And one of those times was for sexual harassment of a client who was a vulnerable refugee applicant who had faced sexual harassment in her homeland, so came to Canada and then got apparently sexually harassed by a lawyer too. And another was for assisting clients with abusing the live-in caregiver program. And apparently, according to this decision, his wife arranged for, foreign nannies to come and work without overtime or proper consideration of like the room and board charges. So that seems like pretty bad behavior too. So my bad legal take is that if you're punished 4 times by the Law Society, at least 3 of those being really kind of skeezy behavior, you should probably get more punishment than 6 months, a $2,500 fine, and a 2-year ban on overseeing articling students. And yeah, don't punch your articling students. So that's it. That's the show. Like I mentioned, we hope you'll go to the show notes, click on that link, and fill out a survey. It would really help us out. We also hope you'll rate us, review, and subscribe. And just a reminder, you can support our work by signing up to our YouTube channel, following us on X, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for the Freedom Update newsletter. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.